Let them be as flowers, always watered, fed, guarded, admired, but harnessed to a pot of dirt. Identity, a poem written by one of our guests today. Did you know that investing in our education system sparks our economic growth and country's prosperity? Our country can no longer ignore and push aside racial minorities, most especially the growing Latino population. We need each other to succeed as a nation. Welcome to our listeners in the North, South, East, and West. We are Educa K16 podcast, bringing distinguished guests in education. We are a call to action to raise awareness about education in our nation, calling for what my distinguished co-host, Dr. Abdin Noboa Rios, calls a renaissance in our school system. Today, we have two special guests whose lifelong journey brings them to us, highly quoted on curriculum and making an impact in Latinos in education. We ask listeners that you listen with love and an open mind and take what works and disregard what doesn't. Shout outs before we start to Jose Carlos from Bottles for our post-production. We couldn't do it without him. And to Dave from DTO Music for our fabulous jingle. And of course to Arterezon for our branding. Welcome to my co-host, Dr. Abdin Noboa Rios. Dr. Noboa, how are you today?
Good. Great to be back. Good to have
Happy to be here with
once
you.
again.
Dr. Noboa Rios, guest, so you know and remember, he is the author of two of the most recent books in the nation, The Story of Latinos in Education and in American History and Critical Issues We Face in the 21st Century. Dr. Noboa, our audience is eager to know who are our special guests today.
It is a pleasure to welcome our special guest today. This time it's two guests at the same time. And this time it's also two guests who are married to each other, man and wife, husband and wife, and coming currently from the Midwest area and on vacation. So we caught them at the right time in the U.S. Because they live outside the U.S. now in early retirement. And so without further ado, let me probably flub a little bit their background and credentials, but they both primarily emanate from the state of Texas. They began somewhere else, but they did a lot of their formative education and later work in the state of Texas. So they bring a wealth of knowledge in this area that we call curriculum and instruction. Much to understand and learn about this area, and much influence in terms of what has happened and is happening and may happen to Latinos in the future. As we know, and we've gone through the statistics, Latinos now are almost 1 out of every 3 K-12 students in the United States. So curriculum and instruction is huge. And bicultural education, as we have talked about recently, is also huge. So putting it all together, we'll get another additional perspective on what all that means. And in terms of background, it's important to understand Elsa Duarte Noboa comes initially from Chicago and then in Texas. She worked as a school teacher for about 4 years in Chicago, then as a school teacher for another 19 years or so in Texas, in the San Antonio area, and then subsequently to that as a lecturer at UT, University of Texas, at Brownsville, and later at UTEP, UTEP as we call it, in El Paso. And so it's a pleasure having her here. And her husband, Julio Noboa Polanco, originally from the Chicago area also, and then in Texas, got his PhD at Texas, Austin, and later worked as assistant professor at UT Brownsville and subsequently UT El Paso, Utah. Prior to that, he worked with the Tomas Rivera Center in the San Antonio area with the well-known educator Arturo Madrid once upon a time, and also worked in the University of Northern Iowa as a clinical supervisor of teachers for almost 9 years, bringing a different perspective in terms of working primarily with non-Latino students, preparing them for their academic vocation in education. And then as assistant professor, as I mentioned, at both campuses, UT Brownsville and El Paso. So sorry for the introduction being longer than I expected, but it's important to put that into perspective in terms of what they have to say, because what they have to say is going to be dramatic and it's going to be powerful and most important for us. Back to you, Sandra.
If you just tuned in, listeners, we are Educa K16 podcast and YouTube channel. Our focus today is on curriculum development and instruction. We are speaking with Elsa Duarte Noboa and Dr. Julio Noboa Polanco on Latinos in U.S. curricula. Back to you, Abdin.
First basic question is, why is the inclusion or the knowledge of curriculum and instruction so important in this country, especially in the context of the largest minority or non-white school child in the United States today? Why is this important? Why is it that we're even taking time to talk about something so basic as curriculum and instruction when we just talk about the basic 3 R's? How does this fit in? What can we learn? Back to you all as guests.
This question is very fundamental because we're talking about what was one of our greatest issues and concerns is the lack of inclusion of the Latinos in the curriculum. And I would say that this is something that we've noticed even up to current years, although that has changed. We'll talk more about that later. But first of all, I would say that the history of this nation would not be complete. It would be distorted and would actually be falsified if the significant and seminal role that we Latinos have played is ignored or forgotten. That's one reason why it's important that we Latinos be included in that curriculum. There's several others too that I'd like to just briefly state. Another is that who we are as Latinos, how we have adapted to the society, how we have contributed to it, how we have been shaped by our own struggles and achievements. We could not fully understand or appreciate that if we didn't have a knowledge of our history in the curriculum. And another thing that I want to say, this final statement about this, and I want Elsa to chime in here, that our children, our youth, and even the adults, they need to have access to this knowledge. This knowledge will inspire us to overcome obstacles, to access opportunities, and to achieve to our fullest potential.
I would like to add, as a bilingual education teacher and a teacher working mostly with minority students, that the self-esteem of children suffer when they do not see themselves in the stories that are told or read in the classroom. This can also lead to some discipline problems in the classroom, and children in classrooms need to hear about themselves, their family's contribution, the history of their people, and they need to see themselves also in the classroom setting. In other words, do I see children's literature or visuals that look like me so that I can feel good about myself? It's important that they contribute, that they feel like they are contributing partners in our society. And it's also important that they get inspired in the classroom by the classroom discussions and assignments, because they feel like they're part of the classroom discussion and the wider society as well. There are some programs, for example, in Tucson, like the Mexican American Studies programs, that have proven that not only do children do better education-wise in school when they're learning about themselves and their community and their history, but also are more likely to graduate from high school and to go on into college as well. So I think that's about like 93% of the students who end up going into college who graduate from the MAS program in Tucson and other Arizona areas.
I'd like to also add, and this is very important, that millions of our fellow non-Latinos, and we work with them in every field of endeavor, it's important that they know that we are of this nation, that we were the first non-indigenous explorers, pioneers, and settlers in what we call the continental United States, and that we have been an integral part of the development and progress of this nation. That's very important for non-Latinos to know that as well. And so, and also I may add, looking at the recent situation here in terms of the divisions within our nation, is that the extent to which Latinos are excluded from the school curriculum plays into that social cancer of white supremacy as it relates to Latinos, as it relates to immigrants, and that will continue to proliferate and cause even more discord and division unless we have a complete telling of our history.
It's good to know that Latinos were here before Plymouth Rock, whereas most people think that we just got here on a boat yesterday, on an airplane from Puerto Rico. So that's reaffirming. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I just took my mic off. Okay, great. Wow, thank you so much. And I think I surprised you a little bit by opening up with your identity poem. I found it myself doing a little research on you, and I love this poem, and I think that you wrote it back in the early 70s, if I'm correct, but it stands today to represent, all people that are not represented, what we're talking about. And so I just want to reiterate that really touched me, and that's why I brought it to the forefront. But moving forward with curriculum and instruction, I understand that Texas curricula rules our national textbooks purchases. As both of you have been involved with the inclusion of Latinos in U.S. curricula for decades, what have been some challenges in that process? What hurdles can you speak to our audience today about that you faced in the Texas curricular process? These are probably different hurdles than you've faced in other states. So can you tell us a couple of stories there?
Well, I think it's important to recall and remember that some time ago, there was an effort by conservatives. I mean, it's unfortunate, but we have to understand the political process of curriculum development. Curriculum development in this country is very much tied to political ideology, as you probably know. And there was a concerted effort decades ago for more conservative-minded Americans to take over the school boards, which they did quite effectively. And I think because of that, and they did this in the local school boards, they did this in the state school boards, and because of that, they are determining not only educational policy, but also curriculum. The standards for curriculum, the textbooks for curriculum, they all have to go through this process of the school boards. And so I would say that in Texas and in the nation, to speak of some of the challenges, I think the most obvious one, and this is the first one that we'll mention, is that there is an enormous ignorance by most Americans about our history, about our culture, and our society. This is a fact. And this is one of the first things that we encounter, one of the first challenges that we have. I also have to talk about that.
Well, I think as a public school teacher, and I taught for about 23 years in a public school and 10 years at the university, what I noticed with my colleagues is that many of our current teachers are oblivious to the history and the culture of Latinos. It seems like we get lost in the history, It's not about slavery. It's not about the native peoples of the country. So somehow we get lost in that. And in too many cases, many of the colleges of education are so concerned about passing the test in order to be certified teachers that they don't see themselves teaching what was not taught while the students, the pre-service teachers, were learning while they were in schools, in public schools. So unfortunately, that only exacerbates the problem in terms of learning new content. Sometimes teachers feel like that's too uncomfortable for them. They prefer to stick to their own methods and the knowledge that they already know and don't want to invest in their future teaching. That's unfortunate, but that's not to say that all teachers are like that. There are plenty of good teachers who are trying to find ways of learning these educational gaps that they do not have. But they will say it's very difficult to teach what you have not been taught. So any teacher who really is concerned about teaching culturally responsibly is going to have to do some of their own research or own learning in order to accommodate to the needs of their student population.
So I want to probe a little bit. Oh, maybe Julio, you were going to piggyback on what Elsa is saying, but I want to probe because you mentioned culturally responsive teaching, but I want to probe, is the Texas curriculum culturally responsive?
Certainly not. And that's an essential problem. I actually had the opportunity of doing some research for my doctoral thesis. And I looked at 4 different aspects, what I call the 4 T's, just to make it easier for the audience and the listeners to understand what I wanted to prove beyond the shadow of the doubt that Latinos are excluded. So obviously I looked at the textbooks, the major textbooks that were used for teaching U.S. history. I looked at the TEKS, Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, which are the standards upon which the textbooks are based. I looked at the teaching, I actually observed classroom teachers, and I also looked at the testimony because every 10 years, Texas goes through the process of reviewing its curriculum, its history curriculum, which of course is the foundation for its textbooks. And every 10 years, you have a slew of people from all over the state and from outside the state of Texas coming to the state board and providing testimony, okay? And that testimony is all over the place. But I also looked at that testimony. So I looked at the 4 T's: teaching, textbooks, TEKS, okay, and the testimony. And I showed beyond the shadow of doubt that we are excluded from the teaching of U.S. history. There's just no doubt about it. Now, that's a fact that cannot be ignored or denied at this point. However, Texas doesn't seem to care about this research or these facts. I want to go back to another aspect of it, and that has to do with the fact that there's a wider context upon which schools operate. And that wider context includes the browning of America, the fear of Latino immigrants, the fear of the loss of power and influence, that others have who are non-Latinos because of the rise of Latinos in numbers. And I have to say also that Hollywood and the television also contribute to this ignorance because we are excluded. All the more recent studies will clearly show how poorly Latinos are represented in television and in Hollywood in terms of roles, characters, and everything. That's changing, but not fast enough. However, and I said this before and it bears repeating, the most strategic obstacle that we have the last decades is the taking over of local and statewide school boards by conservative forces. Because that controls the curriculum. That's very research. And the problem is that Latinos have not been wise enough. Now that's changing to understand the strategic role that school boards plays.
The school board battles are very important, especially in our experience with Texas. For example, I believe it was the late 1990s, there was a rewrite of the social studies standards for social in Texas. And I had a friend from the University of El Paso, actually early 2000s, who was on the 3rd grade curriculum revision for the standards, which are called the TEKS, Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. And we have had for many years Helen Keller as an important person that third graders should know about and her contributions to our history. So my friend decided, Dr. Pellegrino, to say, well, why don't we include Dolores Huerta for all her contributions to the farm worker struggle in California and beyond. And they were very concerned about that because, after all, Dolores Huerta is a socialist. Okay, so we don't know we want to let third graders know that she's a socialist, although Helen Keller was also a socialist. So these are just some of the one of the examples of how controlling the school boards of these conservative states are. Now, they did allow Dolores Huerta to be included for third grade, but just recently she was removed.
And there's another Pablo Neruda story that I have to share with you. Neruda and Oscar Romero as well. They seem to not know who these people are. I'm talking about the school board, by the way.
Members.
To be in the school board doesn't require any educational credentials. You have to understand it. It's all just political appointments or political elections, okay? This is very interesting because somebody was asking, who is Oscar Romero after all? After all, was there even a film made about Oscar Romero? I was particularly insulted because the great Puerto Rican actor Raúl Julia played one of his greatest roles as Oscar Romero in the film Romero, and people are totally ignorant about this. So this is part of it. But let me just add one more element that I think is very important, and that is the view of the United States diversity in totally black and white terms. Okay? Both college and non-college educated Americans see diversity only in terms of black and white. That's an unfortunate thing. And you have people like Ken Burns, as you probably know, the wonderful documentaries that Ken Burns did about World War II, totally left Latinos out, totally excluded. And there was a response to that from Dr. Rivas Rodriguez of UT Austin and the Latino-Latina World War II project. And we responded to that, but it didn't change his mind, of course. But if even a person like Ken Burns has no knowledge of Latino history, what does that tell you? And I think that one of the things that we have to deal with, not only among the non-college, but the college educated, and even in academic circles. For example, James Lowen. You might have heard of James Lowen, the one who wrote Lies My Teacher Told Me. Very famous book, okay, in academic circles. He does a good job of exposing the forgotten items of Black and of Native American history. Latinos are totally absent from his book. So this is what we're confronting.
Wow. There's a lot to digest in all the things that you have said. And I must say that given that we are in the 21st century, it sounds like not much has changed over time. And that's a pathetic statement to make. And so I'm curious of two things. One is, why is Texas so important in terms of curriculum? So we have another 49 states and the territories that don't really have to go by what Texas does. So why is Texas prominent? And the second is, more deeply stated, what on earth can we do to change such a trajectory, given that already, demographically speaking, more than half, the majority of K-12 students in the United States are non-white?
Well, let me respond to that. And this is almost common knowledge among academics in this field. Texas has an inordinate influence because it's a large market. I hate to say it's dollars and cents too. The publishers design a book, a textbook, let's say, and they're really reluctant to make changes and modifications for every state. They have at least 20 states or more, mostly in the South and the Southwest, that just go along with the Texas textbooks. They use the Texas textbooks as their own because the publishers refuse to make modifications and changes for every state, naturally. And so now, the good part of it, And my research has shown that there are some states that do a much better job than Texas, like, for instance, California. California has a huge market. Unfortunately, the states don't follow California's example. They follow Texas' example. And again, that goes to political reasons. But the truth is that we do have, and New York, again, is another state that has much better curriculum. There were some progress. I don't want to paint a totally dim picture of this, because you asked what can be done. And I'll just give an example of what has been done at a certain point. There was a long struggle for Mexican American studies in Texas. I mean, after all, there's very few states that have as much Mexican influence as Texas does. And I was writing about this because Texans identify themselves by this big boot. I don't know if you see the big boot that they have and the hat and everything. I have to remind Texans, where do you think you got this boot from? Where do you think you got this hat from? Where do you got this whole cowboy culture? The great American cowboy, been celebrated in film and the narrative. Everything from the head to the toe, from the sombrero to the spurs, all came from the Mexican vaquero. Okay, most people don't know that. And when they talk about the West and the history of the West, they talk about outlaws. They even talk about black cowboys and everything. But the vaquero and Native Americans, it's about cowboys and Indians, right? But Latinos are left out of the story. The Latinos are the ones who established the first fields, the first schools, the first printing presses, the first vineyards, the first ranchos were established by Mexicans or Northern Mexicans or Hispanos. So this is unknown, and that's one of the struggles that we have. Yet that's changing, because there was finally the struggle for Mexican American studies in Texas, and they decided, the Texas officials, under pressure, that they would actually include a course in Mexican American studies at the high school level for credit. It's an optional choice, but it's there. Now, unfortunately, after several things have happened recently, Abbott and his friends, and the governor, Greg Abbott, and others in other states have decided, because of the fear of CRT, critical race theory, I know that's a whole other subject, but because of that fear and all the hoopla about it, they decided we're not going to teach about racism because it makes some students uncomfortable. Okay? Forget about how uncomfortable we feel being excluded, but that's not important, right? So that's one of the things. Now, Arizona also is a good example, because one of the films that I would highly recommend that we show to our students called Precious Knowledge. Precious Knowledge is a documentary film about a Tucson public high school that went totally with Mexican American studies. There was a huge group, there was a huge reaction negative to that. They were called communists, they were called all this other stuff. It was a wonderful program, and Elsa mentioned that they had a high rate of college attendance. The good thing about it is that despite that negative reaction, a few years later, every one of the political and educational officials that were against this program have been voted out of office. Why? Because there was a political process in Arizona. And as you probably know, Latinos rose to the occasion and showed their political strength. So it's unfortunate, but politics enters into the picture at every stage.
And for more, the need to vote is extremely important in the Latino community, just like in all communities, because otherwise the right-wingers at the school boards are going to be making those major decisions, unfortunately.
What needs to happen, and this is clear to me and all of us, there has to be a movement among Latino educators. I'm talking about teachers, principals, superintendents, school board members. We now have Latinos in professional positions of power within the educational, not to speak of Cardona, of course. But the thing is that we need to have a movement to bring our history back into the curriculum. It can be done, but it has to be a concerted effort. There has to be a movement to achieve this.
Wow. What's fascinating to me is that I had never, and certainly our audience doesn't always put politics in the context of education. But education is a political process. And politics does impact education in many ways than we normally imagine. And so the two cannot be divorced. The two do go hand in hand. And it's important for our audience to understand that. Now, let me make a statement about something I heard, and I may be wrong, but not too far back in terms of Texas curricula. I understand that when you would have a photograph about the Civil War, Example being a photograph of Abraham Lincoln as president, that would be whatever size. You could not have a photograph of Jefferson Davis from the South that would be smaller than the photograph of Abraham Lincoln. And so forth and so on, in terms of other ways in which information was denoted or connoted, depicted in Texas curriculum. Has it really gone, or did it really go that far?
I have never seen that, Dean, to tell you the truth. But I worked in San Antonio, in Brownsville, and in El Paso. So that probably is happening in East Texas and in other very conservative areas where, unfortunately, the Confederate soldiers and leaders are still considered to be heroes in those local communities, unfortunately.
And also, and not to bring in necessarily the gender dimension, but we know that all these aspects are interrelated. There was an issue in a textbook with a woman shown with a briefcase, a professional woman. Mm-hmm. And a lot of board members had trouble with the woman they depicted as a professional that way, because it didn't fit their role, you see? So, not to bring that in, but there's also the same group that's against Latino and or Black representation also has issues with how women are represented. This is
and thank you for bringing that up, because it's not just a Latino phenomenon,
right?
But it also goes overground, not underground, in terms of other areas, whether it's gender equity and so forth, that may be undermining a better or more balanced view of who we are as Americans and as immigrants.
Wow, I feel like we have like 15 shows here to continue this conversation. I have so many questions, but I think I want to hone in a little bit on teacher training, because I heard Elsa and I heard you, Julio, also say, like, people are caught up with the test to pass to become teachers, and then they don't teach what they don't know, right? Or et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, what's going on in teacher training and development? What's going on there? Like, so does teacher training and development need to accompany some of this effort we're talking about? Like, how do you see it?
Well, I would say, and our experience was in curriculum and instruction in both universities. And I would say that our pre-service teachers are very hungry for this information, just like we were, because they have gone through the school system and they know that their history has not been included. So they're hungry to learn this. They're very open and very much inspired to learn more and to also bring it into their classrooms. So I taught many of the foundation courses, but also the social studies courses for elementary and middle school teachers. And I introduced them in so many cases to all these women and Latina, African American, Native American people that they were not familiar with. And in looking at the standards, I would look at a standard and say, okay, this is the standard. How can we accommodate to make sure that we include individuals who have been excluded in the past? So my experience shows that they're very open to learn. And once they learn, they start to promote that as well. And I'm in contact with some of my former students. So every once in a while, I will hear about something that they are introducing or that they had a wonderful positive reaction in their classrooms about individuals or ideas that have been in the past not included in social studies classes or in language arts with good children's literature, which is very important to the elementary grades. So the good thing also is that we have wonderful children's literature that's multicultural, that's culturally responsive, that's bilingual. And kids in the classrooms, young children, just love that. I know that I did not see myself in children's literature until I was teaching at about 35, 36 years old, when I started to see myself and my culture in these children's books that are now becoming more popular, and teachers, parents, and students are responding very positively to the quality of children's literature that we now have. So that's another positive aspect in terms of time.
I think another thing that needs to be said is that despite the fact that our population is growing and the student population is growing, the teaching population is still predominantly white. And so I had the opportunity of working with the University of Northern Iowa for about 9 years, working with predominantly Anglo students. These are students from all parts of Iowa. And they came to San Antonio. And there was a certain system, and I'm not going to go into the details of that system, but every week we had sessions. We talked about race. We talked about social class. We talked about white privilege. And these students are well-meaning because they're in education, but they just don't have the knowledge. And one of the things that we had to grapple with was the concept of color blindness. In other words, there was a liberal intent to say, just be colorblind. I don't see color. You know what I'm saying? But the problem is that you do see color, okay? The problem is that everybody else sees color, right? The problem is that the system is not immune to color. And so we try to tell the students it's not enough to pretend or to think that you're going to treat every student the same, okay? Although on one level you want to do that. You have to understand where they're coming from, what their challenges are, what their backgrounds are. In other words, that's the meaning of culturally appropriate, culturally responsive pedagogy. And so that was one of the obstacles we have to overcome, even with students that are well-meaning. That's important.
I want to just mention that the book that I was referring to that really opened my eyes to finally seeing myself and my family in a children's book was from Carmen Lomas Garza, and that's she has a series of books, but the first one was called Familia, and it was a bilingual text. And by looking at her wonderful illustrations, I saw myself, I saw my family, my tias, my abuelas, my primos. So once I saw that, I realized our children are really going to benefit from seeing themselves in these stories. And I also want to say that non-minority children, especially actually throughout the grades, elementary, middle school, and high school, they're very open to learning about others. They have a good sense of fairness. So when we teach multiculturally, when we teach culturally responsive teaching, all the students are benefiting from that. And eventually, we are creating better people and better citizens for the United States, and hopefully a better tomorrow as well.
And I must add that it's not just teachers, although we're focusing on
Right.
teacher training, the support staff, the counselors, the coaches, the school psychologists, the principals, administrators, they also have to be oriented. They have to become sensitive and knowledgeable about our community. Because you can have a well-meaning teacher, but if that teacher is under a principal that doesn't support their teaching, then it's an uphill battle. So it has to be system-wide.
Top down and bottom up. Meet them halfway. Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh, I have chills because we could go on and on and on just talking to you. I think we're going to book you for like 2 or 3 more sessions to expand the conversation. I just want to say that, takeaways that the biggest impact for the future of America, and this was written in one of Dr. Noboa Rios's books, is through proper schooling for all the generation of students. It doesn't matter where you come from. We're focusing and honing in on Latinos in our education because we've been left out of the history books. But this is the biggest impact we're going to have. It's the future of America is through proper schooling for all the generation of students. Because, and this is again in Dr. Noboa Rios's books, I'm taking it verbatim from his book. It's population shifts always convey cultural change. These shifts affect schools and require proper schooling for all of our children. Dr. Noboa, do you want to add something to that, Abdeen? I know, I always leave you with the last. Tie it in for us.
Well, a lot has been said. A lot needs to be digested. And I'd like to invite our viewers, if they have questions, to reach us by way of the website where this is being posted. And we can also relay some of these questions to some of our guests if they want more information or if they seek for more reference, because I believe that's important. And our purpose in these podcasts is to stimulate thinking and increase the knowledge base. And so I hope we can add value to that by way of this new information. But let me say one more thing in terms of curriculum, because I also went through similar experience as Elsa, never seen myself in the curriculum. But let me reflect on something that's been happening the last 15 years in this country, where everybody, lots of everybody's, are going back to find out their genealogy, their background. Who are they? That curiosity of who we are is a motivator to find out more about who we are. And it's precisely that curiosity that we want to instill in all of our learnings, because that's what learning is all about. And so the fact that us as Latinos are asking these questions is not different from what others have been asking all along. As children, as new learners, we all want to know about our background, about who we are as a people. And to me, that's the broad theme about all of this. What happens, however, is that we don't all have the same opportunity to learn this background. And so it's fascinating for me to find out and talk to a lot of my colleagues who are not minority, they're not non-white, and who come up and say, 1/4 of me is Italian, or 1/3 of me is Native American, and then rejoice on that. And I say, hooray, we are a mix, if only we scratch the surface. So that's a big learning.
We are Educa K16, and we are a call to action to raise awareness about education in our nation. Today, you heard from Elsa and Julio, and they are special guests that we're going to keep inviting to continue the conversation, not just on curriculum development, but going deeper into perhaps, teacher training. And I love that, Elsa started bringing in books and talking to us about the book that Carmen Lopez Garza, Familia, that really brought her into to see herself, her identity. So we will continue this conversation about Latinos in education with Dr. Noboa Rios as my co-host. Please, listeners, listen with an open mind. Cultivate a beginner's mind. Be less judgmental. We really are all in this together, because education is not just in a silo. It affects all of us. And as I said in the very, very beginning of the show, if you missed it, I'll say it again, that it's super important to remember. Well, I mentioned about identity and the poem that Julio wrote back in the 70s, but I also mentioned to you that investing in our education system is really the spark of our economic growth and our country's prosperity. So what a better way to invest our time and our efforts than in education. Thank you so much, Dr. Abdin Noboa Rios, Julio Noboa Polanco, Elsa. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll see you again soon.
Wonderful. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.